Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. I rise today in this chamber in support, in vociferous, in strident and in unequivocal support of the Fair Work Amendment Bill, the Respect for Emergency Services Volunteers Bill of 2016. And may I say first that it was an honour to participate in the Senate inquiry into this bill and to meet and to speak to so many of Victoria's very brave firefighters, and in particular the selfless and courageous volunteers of the CFA. This legislation honours a coalition commitment to protect Victorian Country Fire Authority, the Victorian Country Fire Authority, from a hostile takeover by the United Firefighters Union, the UFU. Without the federal parliament passing this amendment, the CFA's volunteer-based model will be severely undermined, and this would threaten the safety of communities and erode Australia's great tradition of volunteerism and community spirit. The CFA's 60,000 volunteers, including around 35,000 operational firefighters, is one of the world's largest volunteer-based emergency services organisations, which protects people and property in one of the world's most fire-prone regions. The CFA volunteers are community-minded, they are dedicated, they are selfless, and they are courageous. The CFA is a very proud organisation whose members, under that CFA banner or its predecessor organisations, have protected the people of Victoria for more than 100 years. In its current form, the CFA was founded in 1945 after the Royal Commission into the horrific 1939 Black Friday bushfires, and that found that the bushfire brigades, the country fire brigades, the Forest Commission could all be combined to more effectively protect the people of Victoria. And since that time, as I said, the CFA has grown to over 60,000 members who respond to emergencies over the entirety of country Victoria, and 60% of suburban Melbourne also. All told, the CFA protects around 3.3 million Victorians and around 1 million homes. In this protective capacity, the CFA shoulders an incredible burden, as outback Victoria is one of the most fire-prone regions on earth, sitting aside only southern California as areas most vulnerable to severe fire damage. In such an environment, disasters are, of course, inevitable. And the most notorious fire in recent years to hit Victoria, of course, was the 2009 Black Saturday fire, which tore through Marysville and Kinglake, Flowerdale and Strathewen and surrounding areas. In addition to the widespread property damage, the fires struck to the heart of these local communities, as 173 people, 173 Victorians, perished in the flames on this infamous day. And yet it is testament to the quality of both the CFA that 19,000 of its members were on hand in both frontline firefighting and community support capacities. Without volunteers, such a number of firefighters could never have been gathered together to protect Victorians and their homes. If I may quote the Royal Commission into the Black Saturday fires, the Commission particularly recognises the contribution of volunteers and their families. The strength of the CFA volunteer base was evident on the 7th of February. The Commission heard of volunteers preparing for the day, warning local residents and assisting with the confronting task of locating and identifying the dead. Countless more volunteers took up support roles. These are grim yet very inspiring words revealing the dedication and sacrifice of the CFA volunteers in Victoria. My brother-in-law was one of them, and he was deeply affected by that day. Madam Acting Deputy President, volunteers are fundamental. They are fundamental to Victorian firefighting because only they can meet the surges in demand that big fires such as Black Saturday cause. But before I proceed, please let me be clear. Paid firefighters are trained, qualified and dedicated to their tasks. and we respect them all. But I quote the Volunteers Firefighter Brigade's Victoria Senate submission: "It is essentially the sheer number of available trained and experienced volunteers upon which Victoria relies to deal with major emergency events. 40 to 50% of firefighters at critical events are volunteers." Now, I don't know how Senator Cameron can stand there and say that firefighting operations will not be compromised when such a mass of volunteers are relied upon to fight fires. And they're the very volunteers that would be subordinated to union control and demeaned and insulted under the previously proposed UFU deal. Put simply, Madam Deputy Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, excuse me. Put simply, without the volunteer base, the firefighting capacity in my home state would be crippled. And that is something that I simply cannot countenance. For these reasons, I am very proud to stand and support the bill put forth by Minister Cash and by the Turnbull government. Madam Deputy President, the Victorian government this week, this entirely beholden Andrews government, is seeking to hand control of the CFA's volunteers to the United Firefighters Union. At the behest of the UFU, Premier Andrews is pressuring the CFA into a submission over a new enterprise agreement. And this agreement would undermine volunteers and the CFA's operation. For example, it would mean that paid firefighters can only report to another paid firefighter except for level 3 incidents, which is around 1% of annual incidents. And this would sideline our volunteers and provide a potential dual command structure, which is intolerable in emergency situation. That's clause 35.4. Clause 41.1. Union agreement is required before the CFA can make a change to policy, and this stifles the agreement for the CFA to adapt to any present or prescient needs. Clause 77.5 says 7 paid firefighters need to be dispatched before other firefighters can commence fighting, meaning that volunteers can be left to face fires alone for a period without instruction, without direction, without an understanding of the command structure, despite the potential for a sudden and swift nature of fire emergencies. Union agreement is also required on what uniforms will be worn by volunteers, and paid firefighters must have uniforms that are visually distinguishable from volunteers, diminishing the equal value and significance of volunteer firefighters. That's Schedule 20. And Clause 21 says that union agreement is required for workplace changes by the CFA, including matters that could impact on the use of volunteers, such as their terms and conditions of employment. And this change effectively hands control of volunteer management to the United Firefighters Union. The union disingenuously suggests that a clause in the agreement stating that the role of volunteers is not altered by this agreement means that volunteers will be no worse off. Now, this is a complete misrepresentation. A specific clause in an agreement overrides a general motherhood statement like this. So the many specific clauses that sideline volunteers, such as those mentioned above, will still apply. Madam Deputy Speaker, Madam Deputy President, so much damage has already been done in this debate. The effect of the proposed EBA so far is such as a concern about the impact of the CFA that Victorian Emergency Services Minister Jane Garrett has already resigned in protest. The CFA Chief Executive Lucinda Nolan and the Chief Fire Officer also resigned in protest. And may I quote the former CFA Chief Executive Officer Lucinda Nolan regarding the EBA: "This agreement was not going to make the organisation a better place. It is destructive and it is divisive. I could not stay and oversee the destruction of the CFA. I think that this has the potential to negatively impact the organisation, community safety, our volunteers and our volunteer contribution. That was Ms Nolan's evidence to the Victorian Parliamentary Inquiry earlier last month. She also said that she was given a clear alternative: sign the EBA or leave the organisation. Obviously, I chose the latter. The extent of bullying in this debate has been an embarrassment both to the UFU and to the Victorian government. A number of CFA volunteers have resigned and many more are threatening to do so. The CFA board, who staunchly opposed this EBA, were sacked by the Andrews government, and then a new hand-picked board was appointed in an effort to force the CFA into submission. The CFA board stated before they were sacked that they have serious concerns that many of the proposed clauses in the EBA are unlawful, and they have advice that indicates the CFA would be in breach of its statutory obligations. They also said that many of the EBA clauses have no place in modern-day workplaces and are out of step with today's society. Advice from the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission is that some clauses do not comply with the Equal Opportunities Act and would be unlawful. The impact of the EBA, in the words of the CFA itself, it undermines volunteers. This is the CFA board. It undermines our volunteers, it undermines our culture and allows the union operational and management control of the CFA. Senator Cameron is unsurprisingly argues that this act is political opportunism. What extraordinary hypocrisy. The opposite is true. The EBA is a product of an opportunistic, militant union taking advantage of a weak state government that is beholden to unions for their election. In fact, former Labor Minister for Police and Emergency Services during the Bracks government, Mr Andre Hermeyer, said that the firefighters' union attitude to volunteers has often been dismissive. Many of its demands and its current dispute with the CFA are Trojan horses that would sideline CFA volunteers and undermine their interests, with little or no real benefit for the paid firefighters the UFU represents. Mr Hermeyer went on to say that it would also undermine the operational authority of the CFA's chief officer and operational commanders, as well as compromise the fiduciary responsibilities of the CFA's board under the Country Fire Authority Act. Full-time, paid firefighters deserve to have their safety and interests protected, but so do volunteers. This is a Labor minister. He was the one that didn't get sacked. He was the one that didn't have to resign, unlike Minister Garrett. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Fair Work Amendments Bill will address the overreach of the EBA simply and comprehensively. The bill will simply add to the definition of objectionable terms in Section 12 of the Fair Work Act to prohibit objectionable emergency management terms. Objectionable emergency management terms are terms which would prevent emergency services bodies from being able to properly manage its volunteer operations, and terms which are contrary to the relevant state legislation covering those bodies. The Fair Work Commission will no longer be able to approve agreements that contain these terms, and any such terms in existing agreements will be rendered legally ineffective. This will mean that an enterprise agreement can no longer undermine the capacity of emergency services volunteer bodies to properly manage their operations. This simple amendment will only apply to firefighting and state emergency services in Victoria, the ACT and Northern Territory, because they're covered by the National Workplace Relations System. The bill will also give volunteer organisations the right to make submissions to the Fair Work Commission about enterprise agreements covering certain emergency services bodies that could affect the volunteers they represent. I'd like to finish up by quoting Andrew Ford of the Volunteer Fire Brigades Victoria, the CEO. He said in evidence to the Victorian Parliamentary Inquiry in August this year, that the VFBV's issues are not between paid firefighters and volunteers. They are about broader union control that conduct industrial interference with CFA decision-making, and an EBA that he submits effectively dismantles the legislated nature and operations of the CFA and therefore erodes the capacity of the CFA to manage their operations. If the constructive CFA is dismantled, if respect for volunteers and the roles they do and can and have performed is eroded, if the provision to support them to perform their roles is eroded, well then volunteers will walk. And that's the message that I would like the Senate chamber to take home today. Volunteers will walk. I urge the chamber that if the members here value the spirit of volunteerism, if you reject this Orwellian union takeover of a great Victorian organisation, thank you, Snowball, if you value the lives and the property of the people of Victoria, if you genuinely, Senator Rhiannon, genuinely value public safety, well then you will support the amendments to the Fair Work Act, you will respect our volunteers and their 100 years of courageous service.